Right, DPS versus sustain. This one's kind of controversial, simply just because of the wording. DPS, damage per second. Sustain is over a duration. If you're going to measure your average damage over a duration, it's not going to be per second. Some people will call it burst DPS versus sustained DPS. To me, maybe it is expergic brain, but this seems oxymoronic. You got DPS, which is your damage per second, and then you've got sustained DPS, which is over the duration of a fight. So, we'll play it politically. DPS, or burst DPS, you work out by a simple equation. This equation is quite simply RPM divided by time times damage equals your DPS. Using FAMAS as a simple example here, we have 900 RPM divided by 60, which is 60 seconds, times the damage you're wanting to find a DPS of. FAMAS at base is 44,191. This equals 662,865. This goes up and up and up depending on how and what number you want to put in after your RPM divided by time. If you put what you see in the range, your crit number in there, you will get something entirely different. Although that will be a rather bloated value because that's also going to assume that your DPS is accounting for every single one of your bullets critting. Yeah, it can get kind of messy. Good way to do it is add your crit and non-crit together, then divide by 2 and then put that in the equation. That will give you your bottom end baseline. So yeah. Anyway, sustain. What is sustain? Well, this actually kind of gets annoying. Again, working everything from base, we do mag times damage divided by, and it's bracketed, reload plus our mag divided by our rounds per second, which ends up being two parentheses equations. So it's 50 times 44,191 divided by parentheses 2.2, that's your reload speed without modded, plus 50, and then another parentheses 900 divided by 60, close parentheses. This will give you 399,316. So your sustained DPS is going to be considerably lower than your burst DPS. So just because I know we all like pretty pictures, just to give you a more visual representation, we have this. The faint jagged line in the middle is pretty much what your weapon is actually doing. The big red line that goes up is your projected DPS, and the green line that follows the bottom is your sustain. However, why is recognizing the difference between them actually important? Well, to put it simply, and hoping you recognize that the flat line that you see is essentially your reloading, your burst DPS is not accurate after the first magazine. After the first magazine, that is when a separate equation comes into play, which is your sustain DPS. Depending on how you want to play and how you want to interpret this, one will be more important to you than the other. For most speedrunners, meta players, endgame runners, etc., etc., having a healthy balance of both is a good way to go. This is typically why you'll normally see them run things like FAMAS with an M1A. I'm aware doubling up on the meta, but one clearly has a higher sustained output and a TTK than the other. So when it comes to dealing with ads, you can burst fire them down with the FAMAS, and when it comes to dealing with the bosses, you have the ever faithful M1A. Now I do need to add in here that this is per engagement, so right now I'm running around. My first magazine is going to be all about DPS, unless I just completely one-shot a full, which is a good way to get around pretty much everything I'm saying here, just one-shot things. So there's my first magazine, that was DPS. Due to the time flux now, because I've gone over the reload, I'm just still doing DPS. That was still DPS. Okay, firing, reload. Do I go back straight back into firing? This is now sustain. This point here is now sustain. Now it's back to doing DPS. It fluctuates. It's kind of annoying to really show this out in the open world, and 9 times out of 10, due to the way in which mechanically it works, you will mostly be doing DPS. There are a few instances, name deletes, chungers, varying bosses, that sustain will come into play. Hopefully, yes, again, on the range, we can show this a little bit more accurately. So we're just going to put this to name delete. We're going to put it on 5 meters just because we're pro and we want to land all our headshots. If I just start firing now, I'm going to get an accurate calculation of DPS. The moment the enemy dies, oh, 9.4, that's not good. Wait, no, got to get my clickbait thumbnail up. Oh, 9.7, we're getting there, come on, we can get a 10 easy. This is all DPS because the moment the target dies, the DPS calculation stops running. Now, we'll take that, 10.7 mil DPS, mwahaha. But that should also just show how it changes depending on how many crits you actually get, as well as headshots, etc, etc. Now, if I was to try and test my sustain on this, it's not going to work because it's going to continue on from that number. It froze. In order to calculate your sustain, you will need the calculations for the DPS will need to continue over your reload. So if you're wanting to try and get an accurate representation of your sustain, on the range at least, what you're going to have to do is put it to invulnerable elite is a good way to go, reset it, and I'm just going to shoot the target, and you'll see that after I reload, the DPS counter will continue to tick downwards. Okay, so that way it's measuring in your reload along with your DPS. So that was all doing DPS. I've reloaded. Notice how it went straight down to about 6 mil. You should average on a decent-ish AR build about mid to high 6 mils to 7 mil. I would argue this is going to be a good count for sustainable DPS. Anyway, hopefully this has explained the difference between burst DPS, or just what I would call DPS, versus sustained DPS, or just sustain, as well as roughly how to calculate it. It does get a little bit more complicated than what I have just shown. If I remember, I will actually put one of the spreadsheets I use in the description so that you are able to get a decent-ish look at the difference between DPS and sustain, and maybe if you want you can use them as a base learning tool to start your own calculations. Anyway, that just about does it for this video. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.